Welcome to Cracking Conflict, a 15-episode series on the Fearlessly Human podcast. This series is all about friction and conflict, and together we'll explore what really drives conflict, how to meet it with more skill, clarity, and humanity. Because the truth is, we don't get to skip conflict, but we can get better at it. I'm Kavita Khanna, a leadership and culture strategist, coming to you from Aotearoa, New Zealand.
And I'm Dr. Vicki Dalton, a clinical and forensic psychologist tuning in from Indianapolis in the US of A. In each episode of Cracking Conflict, we will unpack the psychology, the power dynamics, and emotions behind workplace conflict, and we'll try to give you some practical tools along the way. Whether you lead a team or just want better relationships at work, this series is for you. Because conflict doesn't have to be a crisis. It can be a catalyst for insight, growth, and change. So let's get curious about conflict and become fearless about being human.
Welcome to episode 5, Recognizing Your Own Patterns. In the last episode, we talked about how the brain works and how we need to start. So today we will talk about recognizing your own patterns. After understanding the brain in conflict, it's time to turn the mirror inwards. Why do some conflicts feel so familiar? This episode helps you to uncover the scripts running your reaction.
Kavita, why don't you talk to us a little bit about some typical kind of conflict habits that we see in organizations, like avoidance, defensiveness, escalation, that kind of stuff?
Well, these are the things that you see in a typical K-drama or soaps. But it's the same for organizations because we're all people. So let me list them, but they may not be in any order. First thing is things go underground, so you don't say what you mean. Second thing is people, the good old gossip and grapevine, so interpreting things differently because you haven't really addressed the conflict. Third thing is lots of politicking. Fourth thing is silence. Silence, which can be anything from a junior person not being able to speak up or give feedback, or silence because you disagree but you don't have the language to express it, or silence because you're disappointed because the expectations haven't been met. And silence is a big thing which is driven in a lot of cultures because you don't want to offend people. And then the reverse of it, which is actually yelling and shouting or physically threatening behaviors like leaning over. That's also you see in certain parts of the globe. That's again culturally driven because that's the way you express disagreement. But the worst is when conflict results in someone feeling harm, and conflict results in people leaving the workplace. And those are really hard to address. So you can address it once you see some of the other patterns, but if someone suffered, and unless they raise it themselves, in my experience, it's very hard to see that, look for it. And that's where we really need to get better at. So this is where I think your experience will really help. So where are these patterns coming from psychologically speaking, so we can watch out for those and help people? So Vicki, what do you think?
Yeah, you brought up like 8 or 9 great points. So I'll try to think about which are the best ones to probably lean into here. The silence thing really kind of hit heavy and hit home. I feel like when I'm in meetings and I notice that some people aren't speaking up, and especially if I get to know them well enough, I can tell by their facial expressions. They've got thoughts, they've got feelings, trying to draw them out. And create a safe space for them is important. But we all come to our workplace, in our personal lives and our professional lives with patterns, way of thinking, interacting, with the world, the way that we see and interpret the world. You brought up pieces about culture. The number of times that I've been in meetings where there's a discussion about, so-and-so is very direct, very harsh. And then they'll point out, no, he's just from Germany. Like that's just their culture. That's fine. And then this like kind of resets. They had an expectation that it would be similar to theirs, and it wasn't. And so we have to be as clear as we can be, about expectations and communicating about them. But the patterns that really probably get us into the most conflict are the hardest for us to resolve, but the ones that we actually have the ability to do something about ourselves are things that you probably will hear me talk about a lot in time, something called cognitive distortions, which are these, we all have them. They're this sort of erroneous filter that we take data in through. And you'll recognize them, even if you didn't know that term of cognitive distortion, you'll recognize things like, are you a catastrophizer? Do you hear something and then start catastrophizing about what that will mean? Are you coming into a meeting, or do you have a tendency to take things personal? Somebody shows up, late or is acting a certain way. Do you assume it's about you? Are you at risk for those kind of things? Those kind of patterns. Our brain gets into those patterns and we perceive them and we interpret them as facts, when in fact they're erroneous. And so one of the things that I work on a lot with folks is kind of recognizing, what are your cognitive distortions? Because this is the key here. We all have them in some capacity. And so learning how to kind of recognize them is pretty important, and recognizing that they're causing you to not see the situation clearly or to interpret things. This concept of, I feel like I can read your mind. I know what you're thinking. I know what they meant when they said this. Those kind of things where they don't realize, but they're misinterpreting what the person is saying. And then when the person tries to clarify, they aren't open to hearing that because they are convinced that their filter is an accurate piece. And so the catch, though, that we'll want to talk about perhaps down the road is it doesn't go well, even when they're paying you as their psychologist, to tell somebody that they are having a cognitive distortion. You have to help them figure out that they are, but you can't do so directly by telling them. But you're asking yourself a series of questions. What's my data points for this? How do I know this is accurate? Is this about my history, or is this really about the situation? And kind of referencing back to that cognitive, or to the amygdala hijack piece that we were talking about before. When your emotions are running high, you really have an incredibly hard time absorbing any new data. So that listening piece is very hard. And it's also hard to retrieve the data that's in there. And that's when people talk about, you'll hear them say things like, I didn't know what to say. I froze. I couldn't, the second I walked out of that room, I had like 6 great comebacks, or I had like I couldn't retrieve it. I couldn't think it through. And that also includes when you're being confronted and it's data that you're supposed to be providing. And so there are things that you can do to try to help you kind of stay centered and focused on those things. But you got to first be aware of the distortions.
I really like what you've said there. It's quite deep, but also that don't try to solve the world. You start closer home, look in the mirror, and I think the benefit there is that you get better at recognizing these patterns in yourself, and then that is a practice that you do, and then perhaps you put on your mask first before you help others, kind of a thing. So I really like that.
I feel like you brought up the point earlier too about the idea that paying attention to the culture, right? Differences don't have to be right or wrong, just differences, right? But what we need to pay attention to are the things that we are probably doing wrong. That's what these are. These are errors.
Yeah, absolutely.
So as we think of their next conflict as not necessarily, think about it as a mirror, as you were referring to it before, rather than as a monster. In our next conversation, we're going to explore what actually takes place, what we can do to manage these strong emotions in the moment, and how to stay grounded when things start to get heated up. So tune back in for our next episode where we will be managing these strong emotions.